Hello, everyone. Welcome to Allot's Have Your Cake and Eat It Too, Ensure QoE While Reducing Costs webinar. Thank you all for joining. I will do a little bit of housekeeping, logistics kind of, before we get started and give a few more people a chance to join us as we get started. So looking at your screen, you should have in the middle of the screen the actual slide deck, the presentation, and then going clockwise in the upper right corner, you should see a Contact Us window if you want to get directly in touch with me or have me refer you to somebody in the organization. At the bottom right, there's a survey window if it's there now, or it may show up at the end of the presentation for you to give some general feedback. On the lower left corner, there is a resource list, some links that you can use. You can use them during the talk or after the talk. You can copy them and hold on to them to access some additional collateral and relevant sections of our website. And in the upper left corner, you should see a Q&A box window where you can ask questions, which we will try to answer, time permitting, at the end of the presentation. And if not, we will get back to you in the next day or two and do our best to answer all of your questions. So we're a couple minutes in, and I think we will get started. So again, thank you for joining, and welcome to everyone. Today I'll be presenting to you the main findings from a QoE, a Quality of Experience survey that we conducted among communication service providers worldwide, and I'll be using CSP as the abbreviation for that. And I'll share with you some of the key findings from the survey, as well as Allot's kind of conclusions and our point of view derived, or in response to some of these findings. Basically, the presentation is sharing with you the highlights of a full report that we will be issuing in the coming week or two. As some of you may know, every year we release between 2 and 4 technology reports, either on the smart, intelligent networking side of things or on the security side of things. And this survey and webinar is giving you kind of a sneak preview. Everyone who has registered for the webinar, either attending it live or attending it on demand, or even if you don't get to the webinar, which is not the people that I'm speaking to now, but everyone will get a copy of the full report, and it will be accessible on our website as well. So let's get started. First of all, my name is Michael Schachter. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Allot, and I'm joined today on this webinar by Ian Parks, who is the Company Director at Coleman Parks Research, and that is the company that anonymously conducted this survey on our behalf, and Ian will introduce himself and describe the survey methodology in more detail in a few slides. Before we get started, since I've told you who we are, it would be helpful if you could share with me who you are so that I'll have a sense now and then afterwards who the audience is. And here we're asking what kind of a service provider you come from. And if you're not a service provider, but rather an enterprise, obviously you click the last button. There will be a number of these kinds of poll questions during the webinar. I find them helpful, when I'm in the audience, but also because I'm talking about a survey and I will be presenting some poll results, it will be, I think, interesting to see some of your own responses to the similar questions before we actually get to them. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, so it's 2/3 enterprise and split between fixed and mobile. Okay, so that's good to know. Thank you. And one more question. Within your organization, are you in engineering, marketing, operations, security, or otherwise? Will also be nice to hear. So we have a sense of the audience. Yeah. Okay, great. And let's see who you are. Okay, solidly engineering, which is good because the survey was conducted with engineering in mind. Yeah, and that's who our audience is. So that's great. Moving ahead, let's take a quick look at the agenda. We've gone through sort of an introduction, and then we'll look into the survey from a kind of high-level overview, and Ian will be presenting that. And then we'll dive into the key findings, and I'll take you through kind of the journey that I went on interpreting the findings, and give you kind of my and the company's perspective on the topic at hand, which is QoE, how to ensure it, and you know, financially save money at the same time, which sounds perhaps counterintuitive. And the reasoning behind this whole survey, why are we investigating QoE? So I don't need to tell all of you that organizations, service providers, enterprises who have to handle, you know, networking and so on, everyone's under a lot of pressure. The survey, as I said, was focused on service providers, but I think the content is relevant to the enterprise audience as well, and we do position our solutions in both spheres. So there's all kinds of pressures. You know, the whole world is always connected, always on, and there's expectations to always have great service and great connectivity. At the same time, you know, this is nothing new. Data is exploding, and data is encrypted, especially encrypted video, and so it's harder and harder for engineers to you know, really control and properly allocate resources for the data that's traveling through their networks. And there's oftentimes during peak hours and even regular hours, every part of the day can be a peak hour, there's congestion. And these are just some of the technical issues that we deal with. There are also, of course, you know, the business challenges. So there's competition, and at the same time, you've got flat and declining ARPU because people aren't as willing to spend ever bigger amounts of money, and so the revenue per bit is dropping all the time. And so the flip side of that is your organizations are hard pressed to spend money on building out the network, and so budgets are down, and these challenges, you know, affect the ability to deliver the quality of experience that engineering is tasked to deliver. Right. So you've got all these challenges, and Allot's position basically is that if you can cost effectively and consistently deliver high or even higher QoE, then you'll have solved many of these challenges because you'll have more people on the network and they'll be happier, and you'll alleviate the congestion, and you'll be able to, you know, have a bigger and more satisfied population of customers, be they, you know, enterprise or service provider customers. And so that's really, you know, the sort of, it's a bit of a spoiler, but that's where we're heading with this presentation. However, having said that, QoE is quite challenging, right? It's harder to measure than network KPIs, and it's harder to deliver and to assure. And so these are kinds of the topics that we're going to be talking about. And let's take a look at how that plays itself out. We did the survey because we wanted to talk to engineers. We wanted to make sure that we understand, you know, your attitudes about QoE and congestion and how they affect each other. We want to make sure our solutions are better aligned. And so we talked to you know, 100 CSPs, and we asked a series of questions around these topics. And Ian will talk to you in a minute about the methodology of the survey. And as I said, I'm presenting the highlights in this presentation, but the full detailed report will be available within a week or two, and we will make sure that you all get it. So let me now introduce Ian Parks. As I said, he's the company director of the research company that we work with, Coleman Parks. And Ian, let me turn this over to you for the next few slides so that you can talk about, you know, how you did the research.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Yep, good afternoon, everyone. As Michael's explained, we undertook or were commissioned to undertake the project for Allot, and we spoke to, in fact, it was 106, being a precise researcher that I am. And just by way of background, Coleman Park spends a lot of its life researching the CSP community for a whole range of different activities for a number of clients. So we spoke to the 106. They were all independent. The people that we spoke to were predominantly, and I was really glad to see that 100% engineering focus of you guys on the webinar today, because we spoke to a lot of your peers and possibly even cohort members. Everyone was in an engineering role, either head of engineering, senior engineering manager. I'll break that down a little bit more in a while. What's important to know is how we spoke to people, or how we collected the data, and we used two different methodologies. One is just basically a telephone survey, so you may be familiar with that. We would have taken the individual, the respondent, through the series of questions using our team, all in native language, or it may have been what we call now a telephone to web interview, where we would have checked that the person is the right person in terms of their role and the type of organization that we wanted to talk to. And then they would have been allowed access to an independent link and a unique link, and they would have gone on and completed the survey themselves. We were given a particular scope of the survey, so you can see there that we wanted to get a truly global picture amongst global CSPs. So 30% of our cohort from the survey came from Asia Pacific, and then 29% from EMEA. And then North America accounted for 22%, and then Latin America 19%. As ever, we had a particular set of questions that we wanted to ask, all of which were closed, and you can see I've listed some of the key things that we covered, but obviously the focus was QoE and congestion management, but we also wanted to cover things around business priorities. Obviously, we can't do any research at the moment without looking at 5G. It's a hot topic. It could be a game changer. It might not be. We also wanted to look at things like, what proportion of bandwidths are leased, what proportion do they lease to people, what proportions do they lease from other providers, and you can read the list out. I'm not going to take you through all of them. Michael's already mentioned, and one of the important things that you all need to know is that this was independently done and executed by us. The respondent did not know that it was Allot that was the sponsor of the research, and Allot does not know which CSPs in detail by name took part. So we have dual anonymity, which is obviously very important to make sure that we're getting objective information. We go to the next one, please. Just by nature of a bit more detail on the profile of the audience, we specifically wanted to get a mix of mobile, fixed broadband, converged, and fixed CSPs, but you can see the majority had a mobile focus. Again, that was a requirement for the research. In our job role, we wanted a range of managerial, senior manager and C-level, and you can see the split there, the majority being obviously senior manager and manager. I've mentioned the job titles across on the right at the bottom there. So we've got our network engineering managers and our senior managers of network engineering, and then our VPs with the suitable splits. One thing that we did do is that we wanted to slightly oversample, and I use that term just because it does influence the way that you will look at the results, but we've oversampled the tier 1 and tier 2 providers. We accept that there's a lot of tier 3 and even tier 4 and MVNO and all of the other players in the CSP community. But it was a specific requirement that we wanted to focus and have 3/4 of our sample coming from tier 1 and tier 2 providers. And as Michael takes you through some of the results, we won't go into that detail, but all of the information, as you would expect, has been broken down by those particular tier levels. Before Michael gets into his findings, which obviously with the greatest of respect will have an element of a skew towards what QoE means for Allot and everyone in particular, I felt it important, perhaps given that independence that we hold, just to give you a few snippets of things that we think are really important with our independent hats on. So first key finding, really, QoE is a top business objective. One of the questions we asked in the study was, could people list the 3 most important business objectives for them? And we gave them a list, and QoE was one of them. And 70%, so 7 out of 10 of our CSPs put QoE as one of their top 3, and in fact a quarter, but 38% of the tier 2 providers actually put QoE top as a top business priority. So it's clearly an agenda item. We also asked around, can CSPs detect congestion? And we found that yes, they can. The majority can. 3/4 or over 3/4, 82% have a centralized tool to detect and respond to congestion, but only 2/3 have a tools to detect underutilized network elements. So again, some elements there which Michael will go on later too. The biggest quality issue impacting customer retention is browsing, which may be a surprise to some of you. We'll go more into detail later on that. And 3/4 of our CSPs have tools in place to measure QoE for browsing. The majority of CSPs having tools in place to measure QoE, even though they've got them, only 40% said that they had the tools in place to improve QoE in the near real time. And this was worst amongst our tier 2 providers, which was really only at 30%. The good news, however, is that 38% are planning to invest in the next 12 months, so we should see some change over that particular time period. DDoS traffic was also raised as a concern from our point of view. On average, 5% of network capacity is lost to DDoS traffic, and 2/3 of CSPs are concerned that IoT traffic might generate DDoS outbound attacks. Also, just over half of CSPs think that 5G will mean that DDoS traffic will increase and add complexity and additional QoE issues. And finally, as I've said before, we can't get away with any sort of survey without a 5G focus. There's some optimism around 5G in relation to congestion. 2/5 of CSPs think that congestion will be about the same in the 5G world, but interestingly, over half think that it will help to overcome it, although only 12% said that they would think it would completely solve congestion issues. And I know Michael will take you through some more thinking that we have on that as we go forward. Okay, at that point, I'll stop it. That's didn't want to be a spoiler either, and I didn't want to steal Michael's thunder, but there's some of the key things that we felt were coming through from the survey's point of view. Back to you, Michael.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ian. And I'm going to be asking you all a few more poll questions as we go forward, so try to forget everything you just heard and give your unbiased answers. No need to agree with the averages that the poll, the survey produced. So, you know, the really good news is that the customer is king in your eyes, and it's all about QoE, right? I just want to say a word about QoE just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, right? Up until the last year or 2 or 3 maybe, service providers and enterprise engineering were all focused, I think, on more network-oriented counters, KPIs, key performance indicators, and the world is shifting to a customer-centric focus where QoE is the quality of experience of the end user, and that's a little bit subjective and sometimes challenging to measure. And so you look for different kinds of measurements, key quality indicators, if you will, KQIs. And a quick example that kind of drives home the difference. In the mobile world, for years, and even still today, the drop call rate is a very important indicator of quality, right? Because if calls are being disconnected as you move from cell to cell, then obviously, you know, mobility isn't what it's supposed to be. However, it turns out, and this I know from firsthand experience in the SON world, network vendors who roll out these networks put a very long timeout so that people who are experiencing poor quality conversations hang up before the call gets dropped by the network. And that keeps the DCR, the drop call rate, artificially low because a disconnect as a hang up is a legitimate ending to any phone call. And so the key performance indicator of the drop call rate looks great. And in fact, the QoE, the quality of experience of the end user, is not nearly as good. And so we're talking about in this discussion today, really that end user experience, QoE. So the survey, as Ian mentioned, shows that that's forefront in everybody's mind today, which is great. It's a top business objective, as he said, and is being measured. We'll see the details in various degrees for various online activities. But the point is that QoE is really up there. The customer's experience is what you're looking at, and of course it's because you need to have good customer satisfaction in order to keep them on your network, in order to keep them happy with your services. So quick question for all of you. Which activities of the following does your organization measure QoE in? This may be a little bit more of a CSP kind of question, but still be interesting to hear. And in fact, I think engineering in enterprise also keeps track of different activities on the network. So be happy to hear. And you can choose more than one here.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe it's the fact that we should say activity do they measure or should they measure if they don't measure, if you guys don't measure it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So all right, we'll move on to the results here, and let's take a look. Okay, so video is in front, and browsing, voice, content upload is down at the bottom, gaming not measured at all, and some of you aren't measuring any of these aspects, and that's certainly fine. One other question I'd like to ask, well, it'll be coming in a moment. Why does everybody measure QoE? Why is this increasingly important? So we asked CSPs to rank the objectives. They're different business objectives from amongst a list, and as you can see from the slant of the arrow, and you can see, it doesn't matter exactly what each line means here, but QoE came in first, as Ian mentioned. It was 70% in the top 3 for everybody, and was the highest single thing at about 28 or 30%. Then came competitive pricing, market share, which you might think would be the highest, perhaps. Reducing CapEx and reducing churn were down at the bottom, although reducing churn could be, obviously an outcome as well. But when I think of like the phone calls I get from my service providers, they don't usually start by asking me, how my services are. They usually start with trying to change my package or sell me another feature. And so it's good to see that at least in engineering, QoE is at the top. It would be interesting perhaps to compare in the marketing departments whether competitive pricing or market share come out higher. But the next question that we asked to kind of understand this was, what's the purpose of that? Why do you rank whatever it is that you rank so high? And so for QoE, overwhelmingly, it was about customer satisfaction, right? And then followed by customer retention, which is obviously a direct outcome. But you guys are an engineer, and you're tasked with quality network, quality services, and so it makes complete sense that this would come out so high in the survey. Let me take another slant at what we just described. And even if you're in enterprise and you weren't measuring any of these, where do you think that unsatisfactory QoE is likeliest to cause customer churn? So we saw where you're measuring it, but what do you think is the single likeliest cause of customer churn? And you can look at this as a user, what would get you upset, or as a service provider who has some experience with what the company feels is the problem with poor quality. Okay. So video, very, very high. Gaming is next, and voice is third, and the other two didn't come in at all. So that's quite interesting as well. It'd be interesting to also be able to check the age demographics of the respondents to the formal survey as well as to yourselves, because we were a little bit surprised, right? Browsing, as Ian mentioned, came in first. The engineers in the survey said that they think poor browsing is the leading cause of churn. poor browsing quality. And then came content upload, even though we tend to think of, certainly the youth today constantly, sending videos of what I'm doing, what I had for lunch, I'm waiting at the bus stop, and so on. Browsing came in first. And that's, I think, quite interesting. People want to get from point A to point B, just like when you're in your car and you don't want to be stuck in traffic. People on the internet, and maybe it's because that's what everyone is doing, even though a lot of video is taking up a lot of the bandwidth, it seems from the survey certainly that basic browsing is still the single most potentially problematic quality issue. So that's browsing, and poor browsing quality was the top 3 threat in 77% of the CSPs as a reason for churn, and it was the #1 single one as well. An interesting twist on this might be that customers equate poor browsing quality with you, the service provider, whereas video issues, they might equate more with the video content provider. YouTube isn't working or Netflix isn't working well, and maybe you guys are a little bit off the hook because they see you as the transmitter of the content but not responsible for its performance. Or again, it may be more around the demographics. So that was certainly an interesting find.
I think, Michael, sorry to interrupt you, but I think one of the other things occurred to us was people do spend a lot of time browsing, and it depends on how you define browsing, because that could include all of the online retail buying, and that we know is an increasing activity. Where people would have put that is probably into the browsing element because it doesn't fit into the others. And we know from other work that we've done is that there's a huge amount of activity, particularly on the mobile phone for, sort of the buying online, viewing online, browsing online before you purchase and all of that sort of thing. So I wonder whether that's hidden into that browsing figure as well and pushes it up in terms of importance.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense, because a lot of what people do online really is basic browsing. And just another point I would like to mention, sort of a heads up, in our webinar survey just now, nobody selected gaming, and gaming was way at the bottom industry-wide as well. And yet, according to Cisco's 2019 Visual Networking Index report, gaming traffic is projected to grow, 9-fold between 2017 and 2022. So we're halfway there, and that's an annual growth rate compounded at 55%. So it's gonna be 4 or 5% of network traffic in just a couple of years, and so I think that and the gaming population is aging, but they're not necessarily stopping their gaming, and so you're going to have more and more of your customers expecting strong gaming. So that's just something to keep in mind as you move forward. So we talked about what we measure. And measuring is important, because if you don't measure, obviously you can't improve it. You can't ensure and assure that the QoE is sufficient. And so there are tools that are being applied, and quite interestingly, when we ask the service providers where they have tools that can help with improving, it was exactly the same places where they think that it could cost them in unsatisfied and churning customers. So I don't know if that's chicken and egg, or it's, let's put the tools where we think they're most valuable, but there was certainly a nice consistency in that response. So it's exactly the same trend. And as Ian pointed out, 40 or maybe 30 to 40% have tools in place. A similar number have plans to purchase tools in the coming 12 months. So again, this, I think, clearly emphasizes that the industry is aware of the importance of QoE and aware of the need to stay on top of that. And that's good news. That is not where we're supposed to be. Hold on one second. Yeah, something happened there. Sorry about that. So the next question I wanted to ask you, because as Ian hinted in the results, DDoS, which is this extraneous traffic, right? These are attack bytes of traffic that could be passing through your network or could be aimed at you or going out through your network, and this affects enterprise as well as service providers. And so that's actually, an ongoing background drain on your quality of experience as well as on your CapEx, because you're needing to take that into account in your network deployment. So I'd like to ask you all, if you wouldn't mind, sharing with us how much you think you're losing in bandwidth, how much of your network capacity does DDoS traffic take up, and then, it'd be interesting to know, it doesn't seem to be here, it might be on the next question, whether you have any kind of prevention mechanism in place. So if you would share with that, up to 5, up to 10, up to 15, up to 20. If you have more than 20%, give me a call. But anyway, you can mark up to the 20 for sure. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the results. And so, yeah, up to 5, up to 10, up to 50. Okay, so it's fairly similar to what we'll see on the chart in the detailed report. And so that's just a money sinkhole for you, right? They're eating your lunch, and so it certainly is worthwhile for everyone to get that off their network. And the tools to do it are out there, and they're very cost effective if you think about how much money you're wasting on carrying DDoS traffic. And so the next question, of course, is, do you have a DDoS mitigation solution? No, I don't, and I don't have any plans to get one, or no, I don't, but I do plan to acquire one. Again, this is all anonymous, so we're just curious how you're relating to it looking forward. Okay, thanks again, and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so that's quite interesting. Half of you already have it, and a third of you plan to get one, and that's great to hear. We'll talk about tools a little bit more a little bit later. What we've seen up to now, I think, is sort of, what CSPs are thinking about today, what they're worried about today, and what they're, applying products to and thinking of applying products to helping. The next follow-up, because we did anticipate that QoE was going to, be an important subject, was, what are you thinking about moving forward? We see what you're looking at today. What are you worried about tomorrow? And so these three big topics were things that we asked about because it's things we've been hearing from our customers. And so a couple of points. So on data traffic, we looked at a couple of industry reports, and we're talking about significant increases, again, from the Cisco report, threefold over the next few years. Another report showed us that in the US alone, CapEx on broadband rose by more than $2.2 billion in 1 year. So a lot of money is being spent on broadband. It's not only on capacity expansion, but that's a lot of money. And of course, there's OpEx that goes along with that, because people have to be deploying and measuring and monitoring and so on. And interestingly, and this was a little bit of a surprise to me, 60% of service providers worldwide are leasing more than 20% of their bandwidth. So there's a lot of need out there for bandwidth, and there are all kinds of ways of addressing it. And a lot of service providers are actually leasing it from other infrastructure suppliers or other service provider organizations. And I think, if I recall correctly, and this will be in the full report, I think 84% of service providers recognize the criticality of managing that leased bandwidth, because you often pay fees for going over your allotment. In the realm of DDoS, like we said, around 5% is what the survey respondents said. But there's concern out there that IoT, as it continues to grow and be more extensively deployed, will increase DDoS traffic, specifically outbound DDoS traffic, and that's a concern that 2/3 of our service provider engineers spoke to, and that is even more exacerbated as we look forward to 5G. So QoE is kind of under siege. There are all kinds of threats out there, and you guys are the ones tasked with overcoming these threats. And so how are you trying to overcome these threats? So what we saw in the survey is that it's some kind of a combination of deploying tools, spending on capacity, and what I call dreaming the 5G dream. So let's take a look at that. So tools, as we saw earlier, 40% or a little bit less have tools to improve it in near real time. But happily, there's a lot of readiness and planning to add tools. Capacity, like I said, there's a lot of leasing going on, and it's clearly important if you're leasing and paying somebody else ongoing for the bandwidth to utilize it as efficiently as possible and to avoid going over quota and so on. And here's something that was interesting. We saw from the survey that on average, mobile networks need to enhance and expand the capacity of 20% of their deployed cells every year. So this growing data traffic that we talked about earlier is a very powerful reality. And we saw that there was an average cost around the world, taking into account the different markets, of about $30,000 per cell, maybe a little bit lower in some markets, a little bit higher in others. And so clearly capacity is a need and an expense, and everybody would like to be able to optimize the use of their already deployed capacity. And then I use the phrase dreaming 5G. As Ian pointed out, slightly more than half of the engineers surveyed think that 5G will nearly or completely solve the congestion problems. And as I said, I use the word dreaming. I don't think that's realistic. A lot of voices in the industry also don't think that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And so if we take a moment to take a kind of a summary here, there is some good news out there and there's some not so good news out there, right? The good news is, of course, that QoE is in focus, and all of us are also customers and users, and so we want to get good QoE for our hard-earned dollars. So it's a key objective in service providers around the world. As I mentioned, somewhat surprisingly, browsing is the most critical activity that's being monitored and attempted to be assured. So there's a lot of measuring going on there, and as I pointed out, things like gaming may need to be on your radar moving forward. There is investment in tools to enhance and to ensure better QoE. And there is, of course, investment in capacity in general. 5G is coming. It's already out there in some places, and it's just around the corner. And of course, a lot of the 5G promise and hype is around, massive broadband connectivity and the low latency and the IoT and so on. But there's the flip side to each of one of these points, right? QoE is a key objective, but congestion is a continuous threat, and that can be because of the growing video usage, the gaming usage. Who knows what the low latency and the 5G new applications, new use cases is going to do to the network. So congestion is an ongoing problem. Video and gaming, as we saw from Cisco's data, are surging, and we all experience that. And in fact, I think part of the browsing, the need to ensure browsing is because video in the background is hogging the bandwidth, and so browsing suffers. There are tools out there for measuring. A lot of service providers, and this is sort of anecdotal evidence from our own customer exposure, don't have tools in place, although on the survey there were good responses there. And a lot of issues around congestion actually come from the help desk and customer complaints. I was driving this part of the city at this time of the day, and the call kept breaking up, but when I came back at night, it was fine, or the other way around. And then, the help desk passes that on to engineering, and then you start investigating, and you get CDRs, and you look in to see what the usage was, and so on and so on. And so, obviously, automated tools that could help you there would be helpful, and even more so in terms of assuring the QoE. From our own experience with the industry and the marketplace, A lot of the tools that are out there aren't so successful, and let's talk about that in a minute. But a quick question, and this was an interesting question, because one of the ways that networks deal with too much traffic is to throttle it. You just kind of block some of it, you drop some of it, and so on. And I was curious to ask whether your own networks, the network itself has configured kind of safeguards to block or drop when you get congested, or if what you do is you prioritize certain kinds of traffic at the expense of other kinds. Within the network, you do that, or you have an external tool like a DPI system, a deep packet inspection system, that sits alongside or within the network and is able to do that kind of prioritizing for you. Or you don't do any of that because it's against regulations, or you don't do it because you don't have a way to do it that works, or you don't do it because you don't need to because you have sufficient bandwidth and you don't have congestion issues. So these are, slightly different answers. The first two means that the network equipment itself, if it's the router or the switch or some other component that's measuring, the cells and so on, are often configured to drop or to block excess traffic when they can't handle it. So it'll be interesting to see how your companies do that. There we go. Yeah, okay, so that's an interesting distribution. There are regulations that don't allow it, or people don't have a solution and perhaps would like one, and 11% don't have an issue today. So this is an interesting distribution of answers. So if we accept my premise that congestion is the QoE killer, right? It's there, it's DDoS, it's usage, it's video, and so on. What are your real options out there? So there is capacity expansion, but as I've said, it can be quite expensive, and that can be, more of whatever you've got deployed. If it's mobile, you can add more cells, you can add more interconnects, and so on. You can lease, or you can try to offload to Wi-Fi. You can add small cells, and so on. There are all kinds of capacity expansions, and that's one solution. Network elements like switches and routers and cells can be configured to drop excess traffic, and of course the problem with that is that it's it's fair but it's harmful, and so customers suffer. And there is technology within many of your networks from the network vendor, be it Huawei, Ericsson, NSN, or whomever, that can rate limit specific application traffic under pre-configured conditions. But from our experience with customers, not many customers choose to use that option. It places a performance strain on the networks, and it's hard to keep up with all of the changing applications and services and encryption and so on. So that's kind of the flip side in terms of the tools that are readily available today. But maybe it's not a problem. Maybe 5G is the silver bullet. But as you might guess, I don't think so. And so I took here a different kind of traffic image to illustrate the point. If you build it, they will come, right? That comes from all kinds of different areas, but it certainly comes from traffic transportation, vehicular transportation. Anyone who lives in a crowded, congested city knows that a new interchange or cloverleaf will just move the traffic jam to another point, and then within a short amount of time, more traffic floods the network. A report that I read from the California Department of Transportation talks about something that's called induced demand, right? So supply and demand, in theory, in business, you have more supply, you can handle more demand, but what they find is, and what we have seen really, certainly on highways in cities and between cities, but also in every new technology that's come out, 2G, 3G to 4G, there were the big promises that now we'll have enough space, you'll get better speed, you'll get better service, and things have improved, but each new technology very quickly becomes congested because the more you build, the bigger the appetite and the more people try to do, and the high-def video and the gaming and so on. And I really don't believe there's any reason to think 5G will be different. And so it may initially alleviate congestion, but I don't think we can even begin to imagine the kinds of low latency, high performance applications that are going to be flooding the 5G networks as well. And so what is the solution? What if you could carry more high QoE traffic on your already deployed network, getting more out of the money you've already spent? Imagine if you could prioritize the performance-sensitive services and applications so that they could, drive in that carpool lane, whereas applications and services that don't really matter as much or aren't as sensitive, like if you're downloading a file, if it takes another minute or two, that doesn't really impact you the same way a streaming video that stutters and stalls or a voice that breaks up impacts you. And so wouldn't it be great if you could prioritize relative to each other under times of congestion so that the important ones get the higher priority? And what if you could do all this while deferring network expansion, saving the CapEx that we talked about and the associated OpEx, right? You would, as we said in the title, you'd be having your cake and eating it too, because you'd have better QoE, more satisfied customers, and you'd be keeping costs in check. So how do we do that? How can someone get these kinds of results? And this is a concept that we call application-aware prioritization. And the idea is to maintain a higher perceived QoE by your end users within your limited resources. And what that means is being able to keep track of your available bandwidth in real time and to be able to see all the kinds of different applications and services that are competing for bandwidth. And as the green line goes up, right, the subscriber throughput is approaching the limits that you've got because of the physical infrastructure. That's the time when you can start deprioritizing the applications and services where it doesn't really matter, right? And so things like Microsoft updates or service, updates to your mobile, or games, new versions, or downloads, or peer-to-peer traffic in general, all of those things consume an enormous amount of bandwidth all the time. And under congestion, it would be great to deprioritize it so that the chats and the VoIPs and the navigation and the streaming and the who knows what 5G low latency car-to-car, you certainly don't want the car-to-car stuff having to wait for responsiveness, because too late there is really too late. That would be a solution, right? And how does that work? So it requires there being something in line in the network that's really seeing all of the traffic and instantaneously, without impacting performance, understanding what the application is, what the services is, and looking at all of those KQIs, those quality indicators that enable it to understand what the end users are experiencing, and then to be able to, as I said, shape the traffic and deprioritize the less important, the less sensitive traffic. And then because it's this closed loop, it's automated, you don't expend OpEx on making this work, and you don't expend CapEx because you're able to do this automatically, and it continuously monitors the situation so that when the congestion is alleviated, you can then go back to your default settings. So that would be the kind of solution that would go a long way towards solving the problems that we've seen that everyone is experiencing. Now, in the survey that we just did with you, we did see that 10 to 11% of you said you're not allowed to do that. And we were, of course, curious about that because we've heard different things from different people in different areas around the world. And so we wanted to ask, and we asked, under what conditions can you legally prioritize? And of course, prioritization can happen at different levels, right? It could be at the level of a service. So you might be prioritizing streaming video for everyone, or you might be, prioritizing one service, a premium service, let's say, against another one. And that could be a service plan prioritization, or specific applications, or even users. And we expected ahead of time, that that would sort of be the descending order of it being okay, right? Many people would say you can prioritize services against each other, but not different applications within the same space, and certainly not different users. And yet, the survey results were a bit surprising, right? There is a little bit of a drop-off going from left to right, pretty much. So a surprising number around the world said that they can prioritize any time. But if you add the any time to the only during congestion time, basically what we're seeing is that around the world, in the neighborhood of 80% of the service providers that we surveyed said they can prioritize traffic when it's needed most. That is to say, when prioritization is needed. So certainly under conditions of congestion, you can apply a solution like what I described above to help your customers get the best quality of experience. And this actually does kind of line up with what we saw just now in the survey as well. We have at Allot a number of case studies where we've actually tried this out and seen this happen. And what we have seen is that we can consistently reduce congestion by a significant amount during peak hours without reducing the perceived quality of experience. And we are able essentially to add 15 to 20% more traffic to the same network than it would have otherwise allowed you to do because of all kinds of thresholds like I talked about before. So on your already deployed network that's reaching congestion in different parts of your network at different times of day perhaps for different reasons, we're able to use that same network and enable you to get more users on the network having an improved user throughput without at all lowering the quality of experience. And as you could imagine, the ROI of that kind of a solution is quite rapid, happens really on the scale of within months. As you'll see in the fully detailed report, which we will be distributing in the next week or so, from the numbers that we saw from the cost, for example, in the mobile network that I shared before of needing to expand capacity in 20% of a deployed network every year, and capacity expansion costing in the neighborhood of $30,000 per cell. If you do the math, in a network that's between 30 and 80,000 cells, we're talking about $15 to $20 million saved annually because you've put 15 to 20% more traffic on your already deployed network. So you can push off network expansion by 6 months at a time. So these are pretty powerful numbers and great for every aspect of your business. One of the pieces of collateral that I gave to you on the links is another case study with similar kinds of results. So let me quickly go through what we've seen here, summarize the findings, and then if you do have any questions and answers, we're kind of running out of time, but I will get back to you with answers. But let's take a look at a quick summary. Congestion is a problem out there for everybody. Just about everybody. Even in our survey, only a small percentage said that they don't have a problem with bandwidth. And from all the projections that we've seen, from Cisco, from Juniper, across the industry, it's getting worse. It's understood by all of you, by everybody, to be critical for customer satisfaction. And CSPs are increasingly measuring QoE because they understand its centrality, but they do need tools to ensure it. So it's one thing to measure it, and to be measuring it and not only how the network is performing, but how the end user is experiencing that performance is critical, but then having the tools to improve it is also critical. And when networks are congestion, overwhelmingly, prioritization is allowed around the world, and we found that in Western Europe with its strict EU regulations as well. We found that in North America, we found that in the Far East, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. So it seemed to be pretty consistent that you can do things to make a congested network work better. And finally, if you can put in place an intelligent closed-loop congestion management system that automatically improves QoE, your customers are happier, and you get additional significant monetary savings. So the final message I want to leave you with is that with solutions like Allot's SmartTraffic QoE solution, and you're all invited to our website to learn more about it, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can ensure QoE while reducing costs. So I will leave you with the final thoughts. Bon appetit. Enjoy the virtual cake and enjoy your more satisfied customers and the cost savings that you can bring to your network and to your management. Okay, so that's my message for today, and that's the webinar. We have a couple of minutes if people want to send me some questions using the Q&A window. Be happy to share with you the answers, and all the questions that come in, we can also then share the answers with everybody. So one question is, again, asking me how I reach the savings and how we've seen, that this actually works. So we've seen it consistently at customers around the world. Everybody has wasted bandwidth. Everybody has underutilized bandwidth. A lot of countries or a lot of service providers are leasing capacity, which they pay penalties for going over. So either they're paying those penalties or they're dropping traffic when they could be actually prioritizing it. We've seen, like you all reported, DDoS eating 5 to 10% of traffic around the world. And the mobile example is one ROI example. Pretty straightforward. It took conservative numbers at the lower end, but you can do it with other components in the network. You can do it in the core. You can do it at different kinds of access. Rolling out network infrastructure and additional bandwidth is costly. And if you can put 15% more happy users on your network without having to do that, then you're obviously going to save a lot of money. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Of course, you can also use the contact information in the Contact Me window to get in touch later offline. And as I said, we will be sending everyone the full detailed report within the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much for joining this webinar, and I hope you found it helpful. There's also the survey window, so if you can fill in some short answers to those questions, that would be great as well. Thank you again, and see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.